The cameras flashed so fast it looked like daylight had broken inside Windsor Castle. Journalists screamed questions. Flashbulbs burst. And standing at the center of it all was Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, holding what the world believed to be her newborn son, Archie Harrison Mountbatten-Windsor. It was May 2019, and the royal family had just welcomed what many called the baby of a new generation. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But now, 6 years later, that picture-perfect moment has started to look more like a masterful illusion. Because the woman who was there, inside those very walls, now says something the world never expected to hear. I never saw any baby photos from the hospital, and there were no signs Meghan had recently given birth. Let that sink in. A royal nanny, brought in just weeks after the supposed birth. And she says, not once did she see any evidence of a delivery. No hospital records. No recovery period. Not even a trace of postpartum fatigue or physical pain. So what really happened in those missing weeks after Archie's birth announcement? And why, after 6 years of silence, has the woman closest to the mystery finally decided to speak? This is not the story the palace wanted told. This is not the fairy tale the media sold us. This is the unraveling of one of the most secretive royal events in modern history. The day Meghan Markle allegedly gave birth to Prince Harry's son. But before we dive into the shocking confession that started it all, let's rewind to the moment the world first met Archie Harrison. The day began with whispers of joy. News networks aired glowing tributes. A modern royal couple, they said. Breaking traditions. Meghan and Harry had opted for privacy. No hospital steps. No flashing bulbs outside the maternity ward like Princess Diana or Kate Middleton. They wanted to control the narrative. To protect their child. That's what they said. But from the beginning, things didn't add up. The palace released confusing statements. First, Meghan was said to be in labor. Then hours later, the baby was already born. The timeline shifted so quickly it seemed like the announcement itself was scripted, not spontaneous. Reporters noticed inconsistencies, yet none dared to question it too loudly. Baby Sussex has arrived, screamed the headlines. And for a while, the world celebrated. But behind the scenes, something strange was brewing. Because while millions of people expected to see Meghan emerging from the hospital, glowing, exhausted, and triumphant, that moment never came. Instead, Buckingham Palace released a carefully staged photo op inside Windsor Castle. Meghan appeared radiant. Her dress immaculate. Her posture straight. Not a trace of swelling, exhaustion, or discomfort. Just 3 days after supposedly giving birth. Women who had been through childbirth couldn't believe their eyes. Social media exploded with disbelief. How could she stand in heels? How could she look that flawless, that soon? Then came the video clips. Slow-motion replays. Angles analyzed frame by frame. A single moment during her pregnancy where her stomach appeared to fold awkwardly as she sat down, sparking what tabloids called the folding bump theory. It was bizarre. It was viral. And it raised one haunting question. Was Meghan's pregnancy entirely real? Of course, palace officials dismissed it all as conspiracy nonsense. Meghan's supporters called it cruel, racist, misogynistic. But still, the inconsistencies piled up. The baby's hospital was never confirmed. The attending doctor never appeared publicly. There were no official medical records released, not even through traditional royal channels. And that's when she entered the picture. The nanny. She was brought in under strict confidentiality, weeks after the birth announcement. According to her, everything about that job felt wrong from day one. She expected to meet a newborn, to hear cries in the night, to see bottles, to feel the warmth of a new life. But instead, she arrived at a silent house. No baby monitors. No clutter. No noise. Just silence and secrecy. And when she asked simple questions, where's the nursery? What's the feeding schedule? She was met with vague answers or polite dismissals. We'll brief you later, they said. Just be available. But later never came. She recalls walking through Frogmore Cottage that first week, noticing how everything seemed staged, like a showroom, not a home. It was spotless, she said. Almost too perfect. And yet, lifeless. There was no energy of a baby in that house. Still, she stayed. Because who would walk away from serving the royal family? But as the weeks passed, the unease grew stronger. She never saw baby photos from the hospital. never once heard Meghan talk about labor. Not a single detail. Instead, conversations revolved around image, appearances, and media optics. It was as if the baby was more of a project than a person. And that's when she noticed something truly odd. One day, Meghan's stylist was organizing a photo session. She overheard the stylist ask, "Will we need to bring the blanket again?" The nanny assumed they meant for comfort. But then Meghan replied, "Yes, the same one. It must match the first shoot." The nanny thought nothing of it, until she realized what that meant. The first shoot, she thought. The one from the birth announcement. That shoot was supposedly taken in Windsor Castle, just days after the baby's arrival. Why would they need the same blanket weeks later? Unless they were recreating something. From that moment, her doubts solidified. Because while the world saw smiling photos of a glowing mother cradling her son, the woman behind the lens was seeing something completely different. Inconsistencies, rehearsed lines, and carefully controlled appearances. Even Prince Harry seemed distant, nervous, overly cautious whenever anyone brought up the topic of the birth itself. "She did amazing," he'd say abruptly, then change the subject. Almost like he didn't want to talk about it, or didn't know what to say. And the nanny noticed one more thing. There were no visiting midwives, no postpartum nurses, no deliveries of diapers or formula, no signs of a household adapting to a newborn. It was as if motherhood had skipped the messy, beautiful chaos and gone straight to the photo-perfect version. But perhaps the most haunting detail of all came late one evening. The nanny was walking through the hallway when she heard Meghan on the phone in another room. Her tone was sharp, controlled, anxious. "No one can know," she whispered. "It has to look natural." Those 5 words froze the nanny in place. It has to look natural. What had to look natural? The birth? The recovery? The motherhood? She didn't ask. She couldn't. Not with NDAs hanging over her head and security cameras everywhere. But she remembered those words like a scar that never faded. And then, as quickly as she arrived, she was gone. After barely 3 months of service, she was abruptly dismissed. "We won't be needing you anymore," Meghan allegedly told her. No explanation. No reference letter. Just silence and a warning. "Remember your contract." For 6 years, she kept that silence. Watching from afar as Meghan and Harry's lives shifted from palace corridors to Hollywood boardrooms. Watching interviews, documentaries, and podcasts where the Duchess of Sussex painted herself as a victim, a woman wronged by the institution, misunderstood by the world. But through all that noise, the nanny held on to what she knew, what she saw, and what she didn't see. And then, earlier this year, she finally spoke. Her statement wasn't made to tabloids or talk shows. It was quiet, almost private. But once leaked, it spread like wildfire. "I never saw any baby photos from the hospital," she said. "And I saw no signs Meghan had given birth. Not physically, not emotionally, nothing." Her voice trembled, not with anger, but with guilt, because she had been part of the illusion. Now, 6 years later, the world is revisiting every frame, every photo, every public appearance from 2019, looking for the cracks she hinted at. The inconsistencies are everywhere. And it's not just about Meghan anymore. It's about what happens when image replaces truth, when a royal story becomes a script too fragile to question. Because if the nanny's words are true, it means one of the most celebrated royal births in modern history may have been the greatest cover-up of all. But before you jump to conclusions, before we point fingers or declare guilt, there's one thing we must understand. This story didn't begin with deceit. It began with ambition. With a woman desperate to control her narrative, and a royal institution terrified of losing its grip on tradition. 2 forces collided, one built on centuries of secrecy, the other on modern self-branding. And in that collision, truth got buried. And now, as the nanny's confession cracks the surface, we're about to uncover the layers that were never meant to be seen. The forged records, the sealed hospital floors, the vanished doctor, the staged photo shoots, the quiet flight out of England. Every piece connects. Every secret has a trail. And as we follow it, from the moment of Archie's mysterious birth to the day the nanny was dismissed, you'll see how deep this story really goes. Because what the nanny reveals next doesn't just question one woman's honesty. It questions the very foundation of royal storytelling itself. But what she discovered behind those locked doors, that moment when she realized the entire world might have been deceived, is something that will make even the most loyal royal supporters stop and wonder. And it begins with a single, missing document, one that no one in the palace ever wanted the public to see. Because the truth about Archie Harrison's birth wasn't hidden in the nursery. It was hidden in the paperwork. And once that truth started to unravel, there was no going back. The world thought it was witnessing the birth of a prince. But what if it was witnessing the birth of a lie? Because in Chapter 1, we're going straight to the missing record, the official document that vanished without explanation. And when you hear what the nanny found in those archives, you'll understand why this secret had to be buried for good. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if I told you that one of the most scrutinized royal births in history might not have happened the way we were told? That the official records, the cornerstone evidence proving a newborn's arrival, might have been missing? It sounds impossible, right? How could a birth in 2019, in the modern era, in the heart of one of the world's most meticulously documented royal households, leave no trace? And yet, according to the nanny who was inside Frogmore Cottage, that's exactly what she encountered. She remembers the first week on the job vividly. It wasn't the usual chaos of a newborn home. There were no baby monitors blaring, no tiny socks scattered across the floor, no cries echoing down the hallways. Instead, there was silence, a perfect, eerie silence. And when she tried to ask the obvious questions, where are the baby's medical records? When did he arrive? The answers were vague, dismissive. Everything is in order, she was told, but she knew deep down that something wasn't right. You see, every royal birth before Archie had been thoroughly documented. Principe George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis all had hospital records, attending physicians named, and public appearances staged days later that still acknowledged a real, tangible arrival. But with Archie, there was a gaping hole. When she inquired about the official birth certificate, her question was met with silence. Not a simple pause, not a polite deflection. Silence. And that silence spoke volumes. I was given the impression that the birth certificate was not finalized, she revealed. It was like someone had deliberately postponed the documentation. Weeks passed, and there was no record in the palace archives. No confirmation anywhere. Why would that be necessary? Why delay the one document that legitimizes a royal birth? The nanny didn't have the answer, and she couldn't press for it. NDAs, security, the constant pressure of an invisible, yet omnipresent hierarchy made her feel trapped. But she began to notice oddities immediately. Doors locked that shouldn't be locked. Hallways empty at times when staff should have been bustling. Staff members whispering behind closed doors with expressions too serious to ignore. And then came the first truly shocking discovery. A week into her job, she was permitted a brief tour of the nursery, supposedly prepared for the new baby. She expected a crib, bottles, tiny outfits, toys, something tangible. What she found instead was a room that looked more like a showpiece. Everything in its place, nothing out of place. But most importantly, no evidence of a baby. No scent of formula. No blankets showing signs of use. Nothing that indicated a child had ever been there. How could that be possible? A baby had supposedly been born, and yet the room was sterile, staged, and lifeless. Even more concerning, she was repeatedly instructed not to handle anything. Just observe, a staff member said. You're here for the schedule, not for interaction. And the schedule itself was bizarre, rigid, choreographed, and filled with gaps that didn't make sense for a newborn. The nanny began asking discreet questions to other staff, trying to find someone who had seen the baby at birth. But each inquiry was met with a polite smile, a shake of the head, and a vague statement like, "We'll brief you when necessary." There were no answers, just carefully constructed silence. By the second week, she realized that no one could actually confirm the birth in any concrete way. Even the hospital she was told to contact had no accessible records for her. Nothing. And when she dug deeper, asking security and administration for clarification, she was met with excuses about privacy and royal protocol. Privacy, she realized, was the perfect cover. It shielded the story from scrutiny. It allowed the narrative of a perfect birth to circulate without evidence. And as she observed Meghan and Harry's careful public appearances, she began to wonder. Were they relying on this silence to cover a truth the world was never meant to know? Then there were the small inconsistencies in the timeline. Meghan's post-birth appearances seemed too clean, too well-rehearsed. Her wardrobe choices didn't reflect the typical recovery of a woman who had just given birth. The energy she displayed in interviews, in staged photo ops, was astonishingly composed. No fatigue, no swelling, no signs of the emotional and physical strain associated with childbirth. Was it possible that the entire story of Archie's birth had been constructed for public consumption? The nanny dared to ask herself the unthinkable question: what if the birth records weren't just delayed? What if they didn't exist because the events themselves had been altered? Her suspicions only grew when she reviewed internal emails and memos she was inadvertently exposed to. One email, marked confidential, mentioned archiving birth documentation for privacy compliance. But the details were scant, and another cryptic note implied that certain medical records were to be handled abroad. Abroad? For a British royal baby? It didn't make sense. Every instinct in her body screamed that something was wrong. Yet she had to continue her duties, observing schedules, checking on nursery readiness, and performing standard nanny tasks, all while hiding the questions spinning in her mind. And then came the day that cemented her suspicions. She had been tasked with preparing a set of archival documents for a review committee. Among the files, she noticed a placeholder for a birth certificate. But when she tried to cross-reference it with the palace registry, it was missing. Not misplaced. Missing. Like it had been deliberately removed. Her heart raced. She thought about the countless times she had seen Meghan and Harry's carefully crafted public moments. Every smile, every carefully captured photograph, every staged public outing now felt suspect. If the official record of birth could vanish, what else could be manipulated? And yet, she had no proof beyond her observations. She couldn't speak out. Not yet. Not without risking everything. Her unease grew when she discovered that no internal staff calendar matched the public timeline of Archie's appearances. The nanny, in her quiet hours, began creating her own timeline, cross-referencing what she saw with what was reported publicly. And the discrepancies were staggering. Days she knew she was in the house didn't match photos or public reports. Weeks seemed compressed. Events overlapped. At one point, she stumbled across a note from a palace aide, referring to delayed verification of birth procedures. The words didn't make sense in any conventional context. Why delay verification procedures? A baby's arrival is immediate. A birth certificate isn't optional. And yet, there it was. With every passing day, the nanny's anxiety escalated. She felt like an observer trapped in a narrative she couldn't escape. Each task, each chore, each innocuous activity carried the weight of uncertainty. And she began noticing subtle signs: Meghan's guarded glances, Harry's distracted demeanor, whispered instructions to staff to stick to the story. It became clear to her the birth had been intentionally obscured. The official documentation didn't just fail to exist. It was being hidden, and no one was allowed to speak about it. She asked herself again, why? Why would anyone go to such lengths to hide a birth that should have been celebrated openly? Was it image control? Was it fear of public scrutiny? Or was there something more sinister happening beneath the surface of these royal walls? The answer would not come immediately, but the seeds were planted, and the nanny knew that uncovering the truth would require courage and risk beyond anything she had experienced in her years of service. Because what she was about to discover next, the details of the supposed first week of Archie's life, would reveal more than just missing documents. It would point directly to a carefully constructed illusion, one that manipulated even those inside the household, hiding the most shocking truth of all. And that truth would not remain hidden forever. But what came next inside Frogmore Cottage would shake her entire understanding of the story and reveal a secret that no one outside those walls was meant to see. Have you ever walked into a place expecting chaos and life, and instead found only silence? That was the first impression the nanny had when she arrived at Frogmore Cottage in the weeks following Archie Harrison's alleged birth. She had been told she would meet a newborn, a tiny, wailing bundle of joy. She had imagined bottles, blankets, the faint smell of baby lotion mingling with freshly laundered clothes. What she found instead was eerily still, almost too perfect. It was a home that looked lived in, but wasn't. Each room meticulously arranged. Not a sock out of place. Not a toy on the floor. The nursery, supposedly prepared for the newborn, looked like a display in a luxury store, polished and curated, but utterly devoid of signs that a real baby had ever been there. From the very first day, she noticed the odd instructions. Observe, but don't interfere, she was told. This isn't a regular child's room. Follow the schedule precisely. But there was no schedule. At least not one that made sense. Empty slots where feeding times should have been. Hours of silence where cries should have been. The nanny's instincts told her something was off, very off. She tried small talk with staff. Casual questions. How was the birth? Any photos from the hospital? The answers were always the same, vague, polite, and dismissive. No one gave her concrete information. No one even hinted that she might see evidence of a newborn. She quickly realized that the timeline given publicly, the announcement of the birth, the few staged photo appearances, the carefully choreographed press statements, didn't align with the reality inside the walls. Staff whispered behind closed doors, sometimes glancing at her suspiciously. Something was being hidden, and she was beginning to sense it. Days passed. She performed her duties with precision. She fed the baby, or at least what she was told was the baby, ensured the rooms were clean, checked schedules, and walked the halls as instructed. But she never saw a baby. Not once. There were no cries, no movement, no warmth. She was being asked to care for someone she had never met. And then there was the nursery itself, a room designed for comfort and style, but devoid of life. Blankets were folded precisely. Bottles were lined up as if for a photo shoot, not feeding. Toys were placed symmetrically, untouched. The air felt sterile. There was no sign of mess, of chaos, of unpredictability, the very things that define a home with a newborn. She began noticing inconsistencies that troubled her deeply. Diapers appeared to be stock images from a catalog. Toys were pristine, not slightly chewed or worn. Bottles looked unused. Even the baby clothes, freshly folded and displayed in perfect rows, seemed like props rather than functional garments. Her intuition screamed at her that something was wrong. Babies, especially newborns, create a certain energy, a messiness, a presence that cannot be fabricated. And yet, in Frogmore Cottage, that energy was missing. The nanny began asking discreet questions, seeking confirmation. Had she simply missed the moment when Archie was present? Were there staff members who had seen him at birth? Each inquiry brought more evasiveness. "We'll brief you when necessary," was the repeated refrain. One day, she overheard a conversation that changed everything. A stylist asked, "Will we need to bring the blanket again?" The nanny assumed this was a routine detail, but then Meghan replied, "Yes, the same one. It must match the first shoot." The first shoot, weeks after the announced birth. Reusing a blanket from an initial photo session suggested that the baby they were showing to the world wasn't necessarily the baby inside the home, if there even was one. Her doubts solidified into something she could no longer ignore. Even Prince Harry seemed distant, distracted, and uneasy. Whenever she asked questions about the baby, he deflected, changed the topic, or offered vague reassurances. "She's doing wonderfully," he'd say. But his eyes told a different story, a mixture of fear, anxiety, and something else she couldn't place. The nanny began keeping meticulous notes, writing down every detail, every unusual instruction, every whispered comment. What she noticed was astonishing. Time inside the house didn't match the public timeline. Days that should have been filled with the chaos of a newborn were strangely quiet. Weeks seemed compressed, events overlapping in ways that didn't make sense. And the baby's presence, or lack thereof, raised the most troubling question. Where was Archie Harrison in those early weeks? How could a newborn simply vanish from the household that was supposed to care for him? It wasn't just the silence. It was the deliberate shaping of reality. Every movement, every interaction, every photo that reached the public eye was choreographed. The nursery, the caretakers, even the parents were actors in a performance. The nanny realized she was inside a production designed to convince the world of a narrative that may not have been real. She began noticing other subtle signs. Clothes labeled as baby's wardrobe were untouched. The scent of formula never permeated the house. Cribs remained pristine. Staff seemed rehearsed in their answers. Every small detail pointed toward the possibility that the arrival the public had celebrated might have been constructed. One evening, she was alone in the nursery, cataloging schedules and checking lists. That's when she noticed something small but shocking, a note tucked behind a drawer. It read, "If questioned about the first week, refer to staged appearances only. Do not disclose internal arrangements." The words made her stomach turn. This wasn't just an illusion. This was a calculated cover-up. The nanny's mind raced. Could it be true? Could it be that Archie Harrison's early days, the ones the world thought were real, were carefully curated for public consumption? And if so, why? Was it about privacy, fear of the media, or something more deliberate? Questions that had once seemed impossible to ask now demanded answers. She began piecing together small fragments. The missing hospital records, the perfectly arranged nursery, the blank stares of staff, the reused blankets, the silent house. Each piece added weight to a growing suspicion that the world had been shown a version of reality, a performance, not the truth. Her anxiety grew with each passing day. She felt trapped between her duty and her conscience. She wanted to speak up, to tell someone, anyone, that something was wrong. But the culture of secrecy, reinforced by NDAs and palace protocol, made it impossible. And then came the day when she saw the first real clue that confirmed her worst fears. While preparing documents for the household archives, she stumbled across a file labeled Archie Harrison Birth Documentation, pending verification. She cross-checked it with the palace registry. Nothing. It was missing entirely. The official record that should have cemented Archie's existence in black and white was gone. Not lost. Not misplaced. Erased. Her heart pounded. She knew that whatever was happening inside those walls went far beyond normal secrecy. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide the facts about Archie's arrival. And as she realized this, the weight of what she had witnessed pressed down on her. The world celebrated a birth. She observed only silence. Every photo, every public statement, every smiling appearance was now shrouded in doubt. And the nanny began to understand the harsh truth. She had been living inside a story that was carefully scripted, manipulated, and possibly fabricated. What she discovered next, the details of the supposed first weeks of Archie's life, would make it clear that this wasn't a case of sloppy documentation or overzealous privacy. This was an active construction of a narrative, a performance designed to hide a reality no one outside those walls was meant to see. And what she saw in those quiet, controlled weeks would forever change how she understood Meghan Markle, Prince Harry, and the story they had sold the world. But what came next inside those locked walls? A revelation that even she didn't expect, would leave her questioning everything she thought she knew about the child she was hired to care for. Have you ever stared at a photograph and felt that something was wrong? That the image told a story, but not the one you were meant to see? That's exactly what the nanny experienced when she began reviewing the carefully curated images of Archie Harrison released to the public. From the first official photo released by the palace, there was something off. The lighting, the angles, the tiny details, all meticulously staged. But as someone who worked inside Frogmore Cottage, she could sense inconsistencies that the outside world would never notice. Clothes seemed slightly too large, blankets appeared repeatedly in different settings, and the baby's features seemed to shift subtly from one image to the next. It wasn't just her perception. She began documenting everything. Dates, times, settings. Comparing public photos to what she remembered seeing, or not seeing, inside the house. What she discovered shocked her. Some photos that were said to be taken in the first week after birth seemed impossible to reconcile with the timeline she had experienced firsthand. The hospital photos she had been told existed were nowhere to be found. Staff had never shown her any. The so-called newborn never appeared during the period she worked there. How could that be? And then there were the videos. Tiny snippets released during interviews, brief clips of the Duke and Duchess holding their baby. She studied them, frame by frame. She noticed details that didn't add up. The baby's hands were in different positions between shots supposedly taken seconds apart. The blanket folds were inconsistent. Shadows didn't match the natural lighting in the room. Even her own memory of the nursery's layout contradicted the backgrounds in those images. Every photo I saw felt manufactured, she said quietly. Like they were trying to convince the world that something was happening that wasn't actually happening inside the home. It got worse. Some of the earliest images of Archie seemed almost like composite images. Tiny features, the shape of his nose, the curve of his lips, shifted subtly in ways that are impossible with a newborn over a few days. She had seen babies grow quickly, but not like this. It was as if the baby in the photo studio didn't entirely match the baby inside the home, assuming there even was a baby. And what about the hospital itself? The palace had always claimed that Archie was born in the privacy of Portland Hospital, but the nanny never saw any staff confirm his presence there. No photos, no records, nothing to indicate a delivery had actually taken place. The supposed birth images were released to the media, but she had never seen them, and according to her, no one in the household could provide proof. She began piecing together the pattern. The photos, the brief appearances, the meticulously staged events, they were all designed to tell the story the public wanted to hear. And the story was simple. Archie Harrison was born. He was healthy. The Duchess of Sussex had done what every new mother does. But the nanny, watching from the inside, knew that narrative wasn't anchored in reality. Every time she asked about hospital photos, staff would quickly change the subject. The topic seemed forbidden. And whenever she tried to reconcile the public images with her own memories, she found herself questioning her sanity. Could she be misremembering? No. She had a photographic memory for details. She remembered the nursery. She remembered the empty cribs. She remembered the silence. And then she saw something that terrified her. A set of private family images had been accidentally left on a tablet during a staff meeting. They weren't meant to be seen by anyone outside the household. She glanced briefly, just enough to catch what looked like an unedited photograph. And it contradicted everything the palace had shown publicly. The baby's features were different. The blanket arrangements were mismatched. And in one corner, barely visible, there was an object that suggested the child in the photo might not even have been inside the house at the time the image was supposedly taken. Her stomach churned. This wasn't a minor inconsistency. It was evidence that the narrative had been manipulated, that the photos the world believed were proof of a happy, healthy newborn were, at least in part, constructed illusions. She began to notice small details in public images that others would never catch. Tiny folds in clothing that didn't match how a baby would naturally lie. Shadows that implied artificial lighting. Repeated props. The same blanket appearing in different rooms on different days. It was almost as if they were recreating moments, over and over. To give the appearance of continuity, she realized that even Prince Harry and Meghan were playing their roles. The Duchess's composure, the careful positioning of her hands and her dress, the strategic smiles, all of it was theatrical. It wasn't motherhood as it normally exists. It was a performance, designed for cameras and press coverage. And that's when the doubts became impossible to ignore. What if the baby shown in the media wasn't entirely real? What if the world had been presented with a mixture of props, staged photos, and rehearsed appearances, while the truth, the actual child, if there was one, remained hidden from view? She couldn't reconcile what she saw inside the house with the images being broadcast around the world. Something was being concealed, and she had been an unintentional witness to it. Even small, seemingly inconsequential details took on weight. She remembered noticing the repeated use of the same tiny sock patterns in multiple photo sessions. It seemed trivial at first, but when she considered it alongside the absence of hospital photos, the missing birth records, and the staged nursery, it became deeply suspicious. And then, she began to hear whispers among the staff. One assistant casually mentioned, "Make sure the blanket matches the first shoot exactly." Another staffer joked about props and continuity. These weren't conversations meant for her ears, yet they slipped out. And each slip reinforced what she had begun to suspect. That the images the world saw were carefully fabricated to tell a story the household wanted everyone to believe. She struggled with what to do. Could she speak up? Could she tell anyone outside? The potential repercussions were enormous. NDAs, legal threats, the scrutiny of the press, the wrath of the palace, all weighed heavily on her. But inside, she knew that remaining silent meant complicity in a deception that had fooled millions. As the weeks passed, the inconsistencies compounded. She noted that even the baby's appearances at public events were controlled to the point of surreal perfection. Hands, feet, even expressions seemed orchestrated. Staff members whispered instructions. Lift him this way. Hold the blanket there. Smile naturally. Natural? She thought bitterly. Nothing about it was natural. And the more she observed, the more the nanny realized the scope of the deception. It wasn't just a matter of missing photos. It was a carefully maintained illusion, built from multiple layers: missing records, silent staff, staged appearances, and controlled media releases. Every detail, every small action, contributed to a narrative that might not match reality at all. It was enough to make her question everything she had believed. Was Archie Harrison real? Had he ever been inside the house in the way the world had imagined? Or had she been caring for a story rather than a child? The implications were staggering. A royal birth, celebrated around the world, might have been constructed to such perfection that even those within the household were partially deceived. And yet, despite the doubt, the photos continued to circulate, convincing the public that everything was ordinary, natural, and joyful. But the nanny knew differently. She had seen the cracks. She had witnessed the silence. She had glimpsed the contradictions. And she understood something that the public did not. What the palace presented to the world was not always the truth. And what she would uncover next, the hidden dynamics inside Frogmore Cottage, the carefully controlled environment, the secret staff rotations, would reveal just how deep this fabrication went and why it had taken 6 years for her to finally speak. Because what came next would show that Archie Harrison's first weeks were not what anyone believed, and the reality inside those walls was far stranger and far more controlled than anyone outside could have imagined. Have you ever walked into a house that felt alive but realized something vital was missing? That's exactly how the nanny felt when she first entered Frogmore Cottage. On the outside, it appeared warm, orderly, and inviting. But inside, beneath the perfectly polished floors and spotless furniture, there was a hollow emptiness, an absence that spoke louder than any sound could. From the moment she arrived, it was clear that life inside the cottage operated on a different timeline. Nothing was spontaneous. Every step, every action, every interaction seemed choreographed. The staff moved with military precision. Rooms were arranged meticulously, almost ritualistically, as if each item was placed for inspection rather than use. And in the center of it all was a young couple, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, performing the roles they had been handed by the palace and, perhaps, by the expectations of the public. The nanny recalls being told her duties were not typical. She wasn't simply to care for a baby. She was to maintain the illusion of a perfect household. And that illusion was everything. A misplaced sock, a wrinkled blanket, a stray toy could unravel months of preparation. She remembers her first week vividly. Each day was scheduled to the minute. Morning feedings, afternoon nap checks, carefully timed appearances by the couple. Everything designed to maintain the story of Archie's healthy, happy arrival. But for the nanny, the reality was different. She never saw a baby during her early days there. She never heard a newborn cry. There were bottles lined up like props, clothes folded perfectly, a crib that looked untouched. The atmosphere inside the cottage was tense. Staff whispered behind closed doors. Instructions were given in hushed tones. The nanny realized quickly that her presence was tolerated, but she was not trusted. Questions were deflected. Requests for clarification about the baby's routines were met with vague statements like, "We'll brief you later." Later never came. And then there were Meghan's routines. Unlike any mother she had observed before, Meghan's schedule was rigid, her movements precise. There was no fatigue, no sign of postpartum recovery. Instead, there was constant attention to image, hair, posture, clothing, even the tilt of her head. Every gesture seemed rehearsed, as if she were aware of an invisible camera recording her every move. Prince Harry's behavior was different, but equally striking. He appeared distracted, on edge, and sometimes distant. He seemed to oscillate between concern and detachment, offering reassurances to staff when asked about the baby, but never revealing personal emotion. The nanny recalls one afternoon, watching Harry pace the hallway, muttering under his breath. She wondered, was he protecting a secret, or was he struggling with confusion himself? Even the household staff were under immense pressure. The nanny noticed that everyone seemed to be playing a role. Cooks, cleaners, and assistants moved with precision, but conversation was minimal. Laughter was rare and reserved for rehearsed moments. There was a collective understanding. Appearances were everything. Authenticity was secondary. The nanny began to see patterns that didn't align with a typical home with a newborn. Meals were timed for the adults, not the child. Toys remained untouched. The nursery, though impeccably furnished, never had the chaos of a baby at play. And yet, the public images and reports suggested a lively household, full of energy and warmth. She began to question her own perception. Was she imagining the emptiness? Was it possible she had missed the moments when Archie was present? No. Her memory was clear. She had been there. She had observed. And the silence was deafening. What struck her most was the disconnect between public narrative and private reality. Media outlets were reporting happy milestones. Archie's first days, his growth, his interactions with his parents. But inside the cottage, the nanny saw no such milestones. The baby she was supposedly caring for seemed absent, not just physically, but in the emotional energy of the house. Staff began to confide in her, in subtle ways. One assistant whispered about rotating staff to avoid anyone noticing gaps. Another joked nervously about making sure continuity is perfect. These weren't casual remarks. They were clues. The household was carefully curated, not just for comfort, but for perception. The nanny also noticed inconsistencies in the daily routine. Meals arrived at odd hours. Supplies for a newborn were missing or inconsistent. Instructions for caretaking were often contradictory. And when she asked for clarification, she was told, just follow the schedule and don't question it. But there was no clear schedule for a baby, only an illusion of one. And the emotional atmosphere was equally strange. Laughter and joy were choreographed. Moments of tenderness seemed staged. Staff were warned to smile and act natural whenever cameras might be nearby, even for internal documentation. The nanny began to realize that authenticity was not just discouraged, it was forbidden. She recalls one particularly chilling evening. Walking down the corridor, she overheard Meghan speaking softly into a phone. "They can never know," she whispered. "It has to look natural." Those words hung in the air long after the conversation ended. The nanny's pulse quickened. What had to look natural? The birth? The baby's presence? Or the entire facade of the household? Over the following weeks, the nanny began piecing together the truth. The routine, the controlled appearances, the whispered instructions, all pointed to a central fact. The public was being shown one version of reality, while inside, a very different reality existed. And she was trapped in between, observing but forbidden from confirming anything. By the end of her first month, she knew that the life inside Frogmore Cottage was a performance. The interactions, the schedules, the so-called milestones, all orchestrated. And the baby, if present at all, was merely a part of the illusion. Every detail, no matter how small, contributed to a larger narrative designed to convince the world of a happy, healthy newborn. But the nanny knew the truth. She had witnessed the absence, the carefully curated rooms, the missing milestones, the silence. It was a house filled with people, yet absent of life. And as she observed, the questions piled up. Why go to such lengths? Why maintain this illusion? What was being hidden and why? Her suspicions grew with every passing day. And then she discovered something that would confirm her deepest fears, something that showed, beyond a shadow of doubt, that the reality inside Frogmore Cottage was carefully constructed, manipulated, and hidden from the world. The revelation would come quietly, in a way that no one could have expected, and it would change everything the nanny thought she knew about the child she had been hired to care for. Have you ever heard a conversation so soft, so fleeting, that it feels almost like it was never meant to reach your ears? That's exactly what happened to the nanny inside Frogmore Cottage. Whispers, hushed and hurried, passed between staff members late at night, words she could barely catch but would haunt her for years. Carrier, one would mutter. Medical arrangements abroad, another would whisper. And in that moment, a chilling thought took root. What if Archie Harrison wasn't carried by Meghan at all? The very idea seemed unthinkable. A royal birth is public, scrutinized, celebrated. How could the Duchess of Sussex, in the glare of global attention, have orchestrated a surrogate birth? And yet, the fragments of conversations she overheard suggested a possibility no one outside those walls had considered. At first, she tried to dismiss it. Perhaps she had misheard. Staff often spoke in codes, inside jokes, or abbreviations she wasn't privy to. But then came the patterns. Mentions of the carrier, discreet trips abroad, and medical appointments that weren't logged in any official schedule. The more she listened, the more the whispers painted a narrative that directly contradicted the public story. She recalled one evening when she was preparing the nursery for the night. Meghan was in her private sitting room, speaking softly to a staff member. Everything must be perfect. The baby will arrive exactly as planned. No one can know. The nanny froze. The baby would arrive? Not had arrived. Her heart pounded. The following day, she cautiously asked another assistant about hospital schedules and delivery dates. The response was vague. All documentation is confidential. Only approved staff are informed. Trust the process. But the tone carried a hint of something unspoken, a tension that suggested the process wasn't just confidential. It was deliberately concealed. She began connecting dots that no one else outside the house could see. Repeated trips by Meghan's staff to unknown locations, delayed or missing hospital documentation, and the strange timing of Archie's public appearances all pointed toward a hidden layer of preparation. The whispers weren't idle gossip. They were fragments of a story carefully buried from the public. The nanny started to notice a change in the atmosphere whenever these topics were hinted at. Staff would stiffen, glance nervously at one another, and quickly redirect the conversation. Even Prince Harry, when approached about minor inconsistencies in the baby's early appearances, would deflect with a tight smile and a brief, almost rehearsed explanation. And then came the private moment that would shake her conviction to its core. While setting up the nursery late one night, she accidentally came across a tablet left on a desk. On it were messages between palace aides discussing medical arrangements abroad and coordinating schedules to ensure continuity and discretion. The words leapt off the screen like they were written to be hidden in plain sight. It wasn't proof. Not yet. But it was enough to confirm her suspicion. Something about Archie Harrison's arrival was not as it had been presented to the world. Her mind raced. If Meghan had not carried the child, it explained so much. The missing hospital records, the carefully staged appearances, the sterile and quiet nursery. The constant emphasis on image, the lack of spontaneous baby-related chaos. All of it suddenly made sense in a terrifyingly logical way. The whispers escalated. More staff seemed to know bits and pieces but were silenced by fear, loyalty, or secrecy. They spoke in fragments: scheduled arrival, same blanket, timing crucial, must match first shoot. Every detail pointed to an elaborate orchestration designed to make a public appearance seem natural while hiding the truth behind a wall of meticulous planning. The nanny felt trapped. She had entered the house to care for a child, but she was beginning to realize that she had been caring for an illusion, a performance designed to convince the world of a story that may never have happened in the way everyone believed. And then, one night, she overheard Meghan whispering into the phone, her voice tight and urgent. "If anyone asks, say the baby has been here since day one. Everything else is irrelevant." Those words confirmed it. The child's existence, at least in the eyes of the public, was tightly controlled. What the world saw was curated. What the staff knew was fragmented. And what she suspected was hidden entirely. The nanny began documenting every whisper, every discrepancy, every instruction. Her notes became a detailed map of the household's hidden narrative, capturing inconsistencies that could explain the impossible. A perfect baby story, built not entirely on reality. And yet, despite her growing awareness, she remained in her role. She had a duty, contracts binding her to silence, and the understanding that one wrong word could bring consequences far beyond her control. But inside, the gnawing truth kept growing. Because the whispers weren't just rumors. They were hints of a carefully orchestrated secret, a truth that, if revealed, would shatter the image the royal family had presented to the world. And that secret would soon be illuminated in a way that left no room for doubt. But what she discovered next, involving the doctor who disappeared and the encrypted messages she stumbled upon, would take the story from unsettling whispers to undeniable proof. Have you ever trusted someone who was supposed to be the authority on life and death, only to watch them vanish without explanation? That's what the nanny experienced when she began trying to piece together Archie Harrison's early care. Every newborn needs a doctor. Every birth, especially a royal one, is attended by a physician, a midwife, someone who confirms the life, the delivery, the first breaths. But in Archie's case, the doctor, the very person who should have been there, disappeared. From the very first day, she noticed something strange about the medical presence, or rather, the absence of it. When she asked where the attending obstetrician was, staff would smile politely and mutter, "She's traveling." Indefinitely. Not sick. Not unavailable. Traveling indefinitely. It was puzzling. Royal doctors don't vanish. Their schedules are public within palace circles. Births are meticulously documented, every step confirmed, every signature accounted for. And yet, here, the essential figure, the one who could confirm a birth had actually occurred, was nowhere to be found. At first, she chalked it up to security. Perhaps Meghan's desire for privacy had extended to her medical team. But then the inconsistencies piled up. Emails regarding appointments were mysteriously absent. Logs of consultations vanished. There were references to confidential overseas arrangements, but no documentation. The nanny remembers the day she realized the implications. She had been asked to prepare a set of documents for review by palace administration. Hidden at the bottom of a folder was a note referencing the doctor. Temporary reassignment abroad for confidential patient care. Timeline to remain undisclosed. Temporary reassignment? Confidential patient care? The baby's birth? The wording was ambiguous, but for the nanny, it rang alarm bells. She tried to confirm with other staff, but the responses were tense, guarded. "Don't worry about the doctor," one whispered nervously. "Everything is under control." Another shook her head, refusing to answer. The tension was palpable. Something about this disappearance didn't just feel unusual, it felt deliberate. Days later, she noticed a cryptic message left on a desk in the private wing. All inquiries about delivery are to be referred to PR, medical staff unavailable. PR, not the doctor, not a nurse. Public relations. The reality of the birth was being filtered, sanitized, and controlled entirely by image managers. And then the whispers began. Late one night, as she passed the staff lounge, two aides were talking in hushed tones. One said, "She left overnight. No one's supposed to know why." The other replied, "It's about continuity. We can't have anyone outside the approved narrative." Continuity of what? The nanny felt the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. Continuity of a story? Not a baby. By the third week, she had noticed the same pattern everywhere. Medical staff, who should have been present, were absent. Notes about checkups were missing or strangely worded. Supplies for postnatal care were ordered irregularly, inconsistently, as if a newborn wasn't actually being monitored in the way anyone would expect. Her mind raced. Could the doctor's disappearance mean that Archie's birth wasn't typical? That perhaps the child being shown to the public wasn't actually delivered under normal circumstances? She tried to push the thought away, but every new detail reinforced the suspicion. Something critical had been concealed. One evening, she was asked to prepare a room for a checkup that was scheduled at a nearby hospital. Documents indicated a time and a doctor, but when she called to confirm, the hospital staff were confused. No appointments, no deliveries, no record of the baby at all. She realized then that this wasn't a mistake or oversight. Someone had intentionally removed, delayed, or altered records. The very existence of a newborn in those early days was being obscured at multiple levels: hospital documentation, medical staff presence, and even internal palace communications. And the most chilling realization came when she discovered a small encrypted folder on a palace tablet left carelessly behind during a meeting. Its title read, "Archie Harrison, Confidential Medical Arrangements." She wasn't authorized to open it, but her curiosity got the better of her. Inside were files referencing overseas medical procedures, coded names for staff, and detailed schedules that didn't match any public record. The doctor had not disappeared by accident. She had been reassigned deliberately, perhaps to facilitate something that would remain invisible to the public. The nanny's pulse raced. She realized the implications. Without the doctor, without proper records, and without verification from the medical team, the official story of Archie Harrison's birth could not be independently confirmed. Every photo, every announcement, every appearance was floating in a vacuum of ambiguity. And yet, the outside world had been convinced of a perfectly healthy, publicly celebrated birth. The nanny understood something important in that moment. The disappearance of the doctor was not just an oddity. It was a keystone in a complex façade, a critical element that allowed a narrative to exist without the constraints of reality. Without the medical confirmation, anything was possible, and the truth about Archie's arrival could be molded, staged, or even entirely fabricated. She kept a meticulous record of everything she noticed. Every absence, every cryptic note, every unusual instruction. And in reviewing her notes, a horrifying pattern emerged. The doctors vanishing aligned perfectly with the orchestrated appearances, the missing photos, and the carefully staged public events. The palace had created a perfect illusion, one that could convince the world of reality, even if reality itself had been altered. And yet, she knew her role in this story was fragile. She had witnessed enough to understand the truth, but revealing it could put her in direct conflict with the most powerful people in the household. NDAs, palace security, and the threat of legal action made her think twice. But at the same time, remaining silent meant carrying the weight of complicity in a deception that had fooled millions around the globe. And the most terrifying part? The doctor's disappearance was just the beginning. The next discovery would reveal that the absence wasn't limited to one person. It involved an entire network of staff, encrypted messages, and hidden logistics, all designed to hide the reality of Archie Harrison's early life from the world. What the nanny uncovered next, including coded communications, unacknowledged appointments, and shadowed staff rotations, would take the story beyond whispers and suspicion into undeniable evidence. Because the truth was no longer hidden in shadows. It was starting to take shape, and what she found next would shock even those who believed they already knew the story. Have you ever tried to get answers, only to be met with walls of silence? That's exactly what the nanny experienced inside Buckingham Palace's extended network of Frogmore Cottage. After weeks of observing inconsistencies, missing records, and vanishing medical staff, she realized the most unsettling part wasn't what she could see, it was what she couldn't. Once she started asking questions about Archie Harrison's early care, she noticed a shift in the household. People who had been cordial became cold. Staff members who once gave vague guidance now avoided her entirely. Even Prince Harry, previously nervous but approachable, grew distant. Each inquiry she made was quietly redirected to the broader principle of palace protocol, or PR approval. It was as if the palace itself had erected invisible walls, preventing anyone from discovering the truth. Emails went unanswered. Requests for clarification were dismissed. Meetings she expected to attend were canceled at the last minute. And any discussion of Archie's early weeks, hospital visits, or doctor appointments met with polite but firm resistance. That information is confidential. Follow instructions. The silence wasn't just passive, it was actively enforced. The nanny began noticing patterns. Phone lines monitored, messages redirected, and private notes flagged for review before reaching her. Even seemingly trivial details were tightly controlled. The staff seemed to operate under an unspoken rule. No one could speak outside the official narrative, and deviations were subtly but effectively punished. She recalls the moment she truly understood the scope of this silence. One afternoon, she attempted to verify a supply delivery for baby formula. The delivery had never arrived. When she asked why, she was told, "The schedule is confidential. Only approved personnel handle these matters." That vague response didn't make sense. Babies need formula. Supplies can't be withheld. Yet here she was, unable to confirm even the simplest necessity. The tension inside the household grew palpable. The nanny noticed whispered conversations that abruptly stopped when she entered a room. Documents that had been accessible one day disappeared the next. Even internal memos about routine schedules contained subtle omissions or redactions. Everything was filtered, sanitized, and rehearsed. And outside the cottage, the story was entirely different. Press releases, staged photographs, and controlled interviews painted a picture of a happy, thriving family welcoming their newborn. Every image was meticulously timed and framed to appear natural, yet inside, she saw a vacuum of authenticity. The contrast was stark. The public was shown life, while reality was silence. It wasn't just the staff who contributed to this controlled environment. Security personnel operated with precision bordering on paranoia. Anyone attempting to ask unsanctioned questions was intercepted, redirected, or told that such inquiries were not permitted. Even routine visitors were vetted carefully, with instructions to avoid discussing anything that might hint at discrepancies. The nanny began piecing together a larger pattern. The silence wasn't incidental. It was deliberate. By controlling access to information, the palace could maintain an illusion, ensuring that the world never questioned the story being presented. Every person she encountered seemed to be playing a role, from senior staff to junior aides. each trained to maintain appearances at all costs. One evening, as she walked down a quiet hallway, she noticed a stack of sealed documents marked